All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think we've all thought about at some point. Just sort of general common ideas that we all have about free markets and when it makes sense for the government to get involved, when it doesn't. And for this, we're going to be pulling mostly from the book Freedomnomics, Why the Free Market Works and Other Half-Baked Theories Don't. That's sort of our main source material for this deep dive today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. We're going to be looking at how those free markets actually work in practice, the power of incentives, and that goes for everyone, from consumers, corporations, even to the governments themselves. We'll see how sometimes those seemingly obvious government solutions, where everyone's like, oh, the government should just fix this, can sometimes lead to outcomes that, well, nobody really intended. And ultimately, our goal here is, I think, to get a more nuanced and clear understanding of those kinds of economic forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we hear all the time, right, is that, oh, those businesses, they're always trying to rip us off. I mean, how often have you felt like you've been on the receiving end of that? I know I certainly have. It's just this pervasive feeling sometimes.
Oh, for sure. It's completely understandable. I mean, we've all had those moments where, you just feel like you got a raw deal or something.
Absolutely. And so Freedomnomics, I think, offers a really interesting counterpoint here. They say, look, there will always be some bad actors out there, right? Some businesses, some individuals, whatever, are just trying to cheat the system. But that's not really, according to the book, the fundamental way free markets operate. That kind of behavior, they argue, is actually more of an exception to the rule. In fact, they say, for every company out there that's trying to pull a fast one, there are countless others that are actually just trying to provide goods and services that people actually want and make a profit by doing so fairly.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is how the book tackles some of those situations that, at least on the surface, feel a lot like exploitation. And this is, I think, a great example that they bring up. The gas price spikes that happen, right before a hurricane is about to hit. You see the storm coming on the news, and all of a sudden the price at the pump just shoots up. Sometimes this even happens before there's any real disruption to supply. It just feels a lot like, kind of blatant price gouging.
Absolutely. And it's easy to see why people get upset, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it just feels so opportunistic.
Right. But the book kind of asks us to, dig a little bit deeper and consider what's happening underneath the surface. Think about the incentives at play. If everyone knows that this hurricane is coming and that gas is likely to be scarce and expensive after the storm hits, what do most people do? I mean, what would you do? You'd probably rush out and try to fill up your tank while you still can, right? And then you've got folks who buy and sell commodities for a living, and they see this coming too, so they're buying up gas now while it's still readily available because they know the demand, and therefore the price is going to be way higher later on.
Right. So you've got consumers trying to, just prepare, and you got these speculators trying to make a profit. But how does all that activity actually benefit anyone in that situation, right? It still seems like a lot of chaos. And it just feels like, again, it's this panic that leads to higher prices that really hurt people in the end.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting. The book makes the argument that, by filling up their cars early, consumers are actually ensuring that they have the fuel they need in case the storm disrupts supply chains, right? And the speculators, by moving and storing gas in anticipation of this huge spike in demand, are actually providing a really valuable service here. They're essentially taking a supply from a time when it's plentiful and moving it to where it's going to be needed most when things get scarce. So in a way, it's the market reacting to a very specific and urgent need, and that price spike that everyone gets so upset about. It's not just some guy, trying to get rich quick. It's actually the signal driven by those underlying incentives that helps to get a vital resource to the people who need it most when they're going to need it most. And so it really is this example of a market at work, even if it feels really uncomfortable in the moment.
Huh. So that's really interesting, right? It makes you rethink how we often frame those situations. I think it ties in well with this other point the book makes, which is this misunderstanding of how incentives really work. They say that this is actually a big reason why we see so many calls for more government regulation in all sorts of areas of the economy. We see a problem, like a price spike. We assume the market has failed, and so we turn to the government and say, look, you need to step in and make things fair.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the common narrative. Freedomnomics actually cautions against this, though, and suggests that government intervention can sometimes actually make things worse. And this is because the government itself, the book argues, operates based on a very different set of incentives than a typical private business does.
And can you give us an example of that? Like, what's the difference in incentives between a government entity and a private company?
Sure. A government-run firm, they argue, might not be primarily focused on generating profit in the same way that a private company is. They may be more concerned with, say, increasing their own size, their influence, or even gaining market share in a particular industry, even if it means losing money in the short term. This could actually lead to a situation where they might engage in what's called predatory pricing.
And predatory pricing, for anyone who's not familiar with that term, is basically when a company drops their prices really low, sometimes even below what it costs them to produce something, to try and drive their competitors out of business.
Well,
And this is often seen as, kind of an anti-competitive tactic.
right. And it's interesting because this flips the usual argument that we hear, right? Typically, the concern is that big private companies are the ones who are going to use these predatory pricing tactics to create monopolies. But Freedomnomics is saying, hold on, actually, government entities might be more tempted to do this because their goals aren't necessarily the same as a company that's beholden to shareholders and has to show a profit.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And it kind of leads us into this whole discussion of monopolies, right? Because I think there's this widespread fear that a monopoly is always a bad thing for consumers. We tend to think, oh, a massive company that controls an entire industry is just going to jack up prices whenever they want, and we're all going to be stuck paying those high prices because there's no alternative.
It's this classic image, right? That evil corporation just raking in the cash while everyone else is suffering. But Freedomnomics actually argues that true monopolies are actually pretty rare, and they're surprisingly difficult to maintain over the long term in a free market.
And why is that? You would think that if a company gets big enough, they'd have so much power and control that they'd basically be untouchable.
The book says that this constant pressure of competition, or even the potential for future competition, actually acts as this kind of natural check on that kind of unchecked power. If a company becomes too dominant and starts charging those really high prices, it creates this huge opportunity for new businesses to jump in and say, hey, we can offer the same thing, but at a way better price. And then, of course, they start stealing away customers from that big bloated company. So it becomes this constant game of trying to stay ahead of the curve and keep prices low enough to prevent anyone else from taking your market share.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those monopolies that do exist, right? Like pharmaceutical companies with patents. Those seem like pretty real monopolies to me. And don't they take advantage of their position to charge those really high drug prices that we hear so much about?
That's a really good question. And Freedomnomics actually has a kind of a nuanced perspective on this. They acknowledge that these are indeed temporary monopolies that are granted by the government through patents, but they argue that these temporary monopolies can actually end up benefiting consumers in the long run.
Okay, now that sounds counterintuitive to me. How does that work?
Well, think about it. Developing new medications, I mean, that's an incredibly expensive and time-consuming process. You've got years of research, tons of clinical trials, all these regulatory hurdles to jump through. But then, once you actually have the drug, manufacturing it, that's often actually pretty cheap. So if any company could just come in and immediately copy a new drug, as soon as it hit the market, the original company that actually spent all that money and all that time and effort to actually develop the drug, they wouldn't be able to recover their investment, right? There'd be no incentive to put all that time and effort and billions of dollars into that research and development if you knew that you weren't going to be able to make any profit from it. And so, in a way, these temporary monopolies, they actually encourage innovation in the long run because they give companies that incentive to put in the work and to invest in developing those new drugs that could potentially be, life-saving for people.
That's a really good point. It kind of makes you rethink the way that we often frame those pharmaceutical patents. It's not just about protecting profits, it's about making sure that those new discoveries actually happen in the first place.
Exactly. And along those lines, the book also touches on something called price discrimination. Now, that might sound negative at first, right? Like, oh, discrimination. But they argue that it can actually increase the availability of products and also encourage innovation.
So price discrimination, for anyone who's not familiar, is basically when a company charges different prices to different customers for the same product or service. And those price differences, again, aren't just based on the cost of producing that good or service. Think, student discounts or those different airline ticket prices that you see for the same seat, right?
Yeah.
You buy it early, it costs this much. You buy it the last minute, it costs way more, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And so it does, at first glance, seem a bit unfair, right? Like, why should some people have to pay more for the same thing?
Yeah, it feels a bit like, someone's getting taken advantage of.
Yeah, right. But Freedomnomics points out that in some cases, This practice can actually allow companies to offer products to a wider range of consumers by charging higher prices to those who are willing to pay more. For example, maybe they really value the convenience of buying something last minute, or they really need that specific flight. So those customers who have a higher willingness to pay, essentially they're helping to subsidize those who are more price sensitive and wouldn't be able to afford the product if it was only offered at that higher price. It's kind of like, those early bird discounts that you see at a lot of conferences or events, right? The people who are willing to commit early and pay full price are helping to make the event more affordable for those who might not be able to afford it otherwise.
That's a really good analogy. It helps to see how it's not always just about, squeezing more money out of certain customers. There can actually be a benefit to consumers as a whole.
Exactly. And they actually have a really interesting example in the book about seltzer versus cola. And often, seltzer's more expensive than cola, right? And you might think, well, maybe that's just because seltzer drinkers tend to have higher incomes and the companies are just trying to exploit that. But the book argues that there's actually a more likely reason for this price difference, and that's the different production costs involved. Higher quality water, more carbonation, those things might actually cost more for plain seltzer. And those costs aren't masked by, all the sugar and flavorings that you have in a cola. So they're arguing that the price difference often reflects those very real differences in the cost of production. And it's not necessarily an attempt to, just charge seltzer drinkers more because they're willing to pay more.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a good reminder that, we shouldn't always jump to conclusions about price discrimination. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons why prices might be different.
Absolutely. And another kind of common myth that they tackle in the book is this idea of predatory pricing as this easy path to creating a monopoly. That idea that a big, powerful company can just slash their prices to drive out all the competition. And then once they're the only game in town, they jack those prices right back up again.
And this is kind of a classic fear, right? That big companies will use their deep pockets to crush the little guy. And then once they have all the power, they can do whatever they want.
Right. But Freedomnomics argues that this strategy actually has a lot of inherent problems. And in a way, it actually creates opportunities for new competitors to jump in.
Okay, but how does that work? I mean, if a big company is willing to just lose money for a while to kill off their rivals, wouldn't that scare off anyone else from even trying to compete with them?
Well, for predatory pricing to really work, the company that's doing it, they can't just lower their prices, right? They actually have to increase how much they're selling to actually capture all those sales that would have gone to their competitors. So they're losing money on every unit that they sell, but they're hoping to make up for it by selling a lot more units. And even if they do manage to drive everyone else out of the market to make up for all those losses, they'd have to raise prices even higher than they were before they started this whole predatory pricing scheme. And those really high prices would then become this huge incentive for new companies to come in and say, hey, we can undercut your prices, and then the whole cycle starts again. So the book describes this as kind of a Ferris wheel of constantly lowering and raising prices, which doesn't really make much economic sense in the long run. It's not a sustainable way to maintain a monopoly because it creates this constant threat of new competition.
Right. So those incentives end up working against the company that's trying to maintain that monopoly. They create this sort of like self-defeating prophecy in a way.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a little bit, we often hear about how, as consumers, we're at the mercy of experts because they just have so much more information than we do. It's kind of a classic example of what economists call information asymmetry, right? Where one party has way more knowledge about something than the other party. And actually, Freedomnomics mentions that Freakonomics portrays the free market as this kind of cutthroat place where consumers are just constantly getting ripped off because of this problem.
Yeah, that's something that I think we've all experienced at some point, right?
Yeah.
You go to the mechanic and you're like, I don't know anything about cars. How do I know if this guy is telling me the truth about what needs to be fixed? Or you go to the doctor and they're like, oh, you need this procedure. And you're like, well, how do I know if I really need it or if they're just trying to make more money?
Right. And so Freedomnomics offers a slightly different perspective on this. They emphasize the power of reputation, which is something that's often overlooked, as this really significant force that actually discourages a lot of that dishonest behavior. So when we talk about information asymmetry, the seller, the person providing the service, they do often have a lot more knowledge about what they're selling than we do as buyers, right?
Reputation.
Yeah.
Like, how does that really protect us from, say, a dishonest mechanic or a doctor who's recommending procedures that we don't really need.
Well, they explain that the high quality premium that we often pay for goods and services from, well-known companies or professionals, it actually reflects the value of that reputation, right? It's the extra that we're willing to pay for that confidence in their quality and their reliability. And so a company with a good reputation, they have a lot to lose if they start engaging in shady practices.
Okay, so it's like the more you've invested in building that good reputation, the more you have to lose if you start cheating people, basically.
Exactly. Think about, for example, a luxury car maker, right?
Uh,
They charge a premium price for their cars because they have this reputation for quality, reliability, all that. Now imagine if they suddenly started selling unreliable cars, right? They might be able to get away with it for a little while just because of that past reputation, but eventually people would figure out that the quality had gone down and their reputation would suffer.
hmm.
And they would have to lower their prices because people wouldn't be willing to pay that premium anymore for a brand that they no longer trust. So it's this fear of losing that hard-earned reputation and, of course, the future profits that come with it
Yeah.
that actually acts as this kind of self-regulating mechanism in the market.
Right. So it's like it's not just about ethical behavior, it's also about smart business.
Exactly. And now left into a topic that I think is a little bit thought-provoking, maybe a little bit controversial, but it's this idea of crime and incentives. And Freedomnomics looks at crime through that same lens that we've been talking about, the lens of incentives. And they come to some really surprising conclusions about, what kinds of policies actually work in terms of reducing crime.
Yeah. And this is something that obviously there's a lot of debate about, right? I mean, what causes crime? What are the best ways to address it? These are really complex issues. But the book definitely offers a unique perspective on this. So what are some of the key findings that they highlight?
Well, they look at that, significant drop in crime rates that we saw in the 1990s, and they attribute that to a few key factors, including the increased use of the death penalty, higher rates of arrests for criminals, and also the spread of laws that allow people to carry concealed firearms. Now, these are all definitely topics that, as you said, spark a lot of debate, and the book acknowledges that.
Right. And I think it's important to be clear here. We're not necessarily endorsing any of these viewpoints. We're just trying to, lay out what the book says and let our listeners decide for themselves what they think.
Exactly. So, on the death penalty, the book argues that it acts as a deterrent for potential murderers, right?
Right.
They point to a statistic from 2005 that showed that a murderer was 20 times more likely to be executed than a police officer was to be killed while on duty. So the argument is that if you know that there's this very real possibility that you could be executed if you commit murder, you're less likely to actually do it.
Yeah, it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis, right? Like weighing the potential consequences against the potential gains.
Right. And then on higher arrest rates, the book emphasizes that just increasing the likelihood of getting caught, that's a huge deterrent for crime. And so they argue that kind of like everyday police work, right, that leads to arrests, that actually has a huge impact on public safety.
It's interesting, right? Because we often think about these like really big sweeping policies, but sometimes it's the like day-to-day stuff that actually makes the biggest difference.
Exactly. And then on concealed carry laws, the book points to evidence suggesting that, allowing law-abiding citizens to carry firearms for self-defense can actually make potential criminals think twice up committing a crime.
Right, because they don't know who might be armed.
Exactly. And so it's this idea of increasing the risk to the criminal, which again goes back to that cost-benefit analysis. Now, what's even more interesting is that the book also talks about policies that they argue didn't have a significant impact on crime rates, or in some cases might have even had negative consequences. And some of those include things like federal gun control bills, that whole broken windows policing theory, and even some types of affirmative action programs in police departments.
Now, that last one, that's really surprising to me. How could affirmative action in police departments potentially lead to an increase in crime?
Well, the book argues that, by potentially lowering the overall effectiveness of the police force in high crime areas, for example, by getting rid of intelligence testing as a requirement for becoming a police officer, these policies could actually end up harming the very communities that they're intended to help. It's this idea of, you try to do something good, but you don't think through the potential consequences, and you end up actually making things worse. And then they also touch on that really interesting argument that was made in Freakonomics about the link between the legalization of abortion and the decrease in crime.
Right. That was a huge conversation starter, right?
Yeah.
That book argued that, because legalized abortion led to fewer unwanted children, and those unwanted children are more likely to grow up to commit crimes, that's why we saw this drop in crime rates in the 90s.
Yeah. But Freedomnomics actually presents a counter-argument to that. They say that, by increasing the number of births outside of marriage, abortion actually significantly increased crime.
And that's a completely different conclusion, right? It's kind of like a 180 from the Freakonomics argument.
Right. And their reasoning is that, this rise in births to single mothers, which they argue disproportionately affected African Americans, led to more children being raised in single-parent households, which they argue is linked to higher crime rates. And they also raised some questions about the data that was used in some of the studies that supported the original Freakonomics theory. They emphasize the importance of using this specific FBI data that they say more accurately links crime dates to birth dates. And they say that this data actually supports their conclusion that legalized abortion actually led to more murders.
So it's a really different way of looking at the data and at those cause and effect relationships.
Exactly. And then let's move on to this other topic, which we've kind of touched on already, but it's this idea of the unintended consequences of regulation. This is something that Freedomnomics really emphasizes as a key concern. It's that, we see regulations put in place all the time, and often they are put in place with good intentions, right?
Yeah.
But they don't always play out the way that we expect them to.
Yeah, it's like you try to solve one problem, but you end up creating a whole bunch of other problems in the process.
Exactly. And Freedomnomics provides a couple of interesting examples of how seemingly well-meaning regulations can actually backfire, because the people who are making those regulations, they don't fully think through how those regulations are going to change people's behavior. And again, it goes back to those incentives that we were talking about earlier.
Right, because if you change the rules of the game, people are going to change the way that they play the game.
Exactly. So one of the examples that they give is changes to worker compensation insurance that happened back in the late 1970s. So before these changes, workers who got injured on the job, they had a relatively easy way to get compensation for those injuries. They didn't necessarily have to hire lawyers or anything like that. But in exchange for that ease of access to compensation, their ability to sue their employers was limited. So it was this kind of trade-off, right? It's like, we'll make easy for you to get compensation, but you can't sue us for millions of dollars. And this system led to what were essentially risk premiums being built into the wages of workers in more dangerous industries. So if you knew that you were taking on more risk by working in, say, construction or mining, you would get paid more to compensate for that risk. But then when those changes came along that made it much easier for workers to sue their employers for workplace injuries, companies no longer needed to offer those higher wages because those risk premiums were essentially built into the ease of getting compensation through that previous system. And so wages in those industries actually went down.
Wow, so it's like in trying to help workers by making it easier for them to sue, they actually ended up hurting them financially.
Right. And it's one of those unintended consequences that you just don't always see coming. Another example that they give is campaign finance laws. So these laws are often put in place to try to reduce corruption in politics and to try to make elections more competitive. But Freedomnomics actually argues that these regulations might have actually made things worse in some ways.
Okay, now, how could limiting campaign contributions actually make things less competitive? I mean, wouldn't that level the playing field and give everyone a fairer shot?
Well, they argue that by putting these strict limits on how much money can be donated and spent on campaigns, it actually makes it much harder for lesser-known candidates to raise the funds that they need to get their message out there, to really compete effectively against incumbents who already have that name recognition. They have those established networks of donors and so on. And they actually point out that the percentage of incumbents who win re-election in federal races has actually increased since those regulations were put in place back in 1974.
Interesting. So it's like in trying to, limit the influence of money in politics, they might have actually made it harder for challengers to unseat incumbents.
Exactly. And they also argue that these laws can actually lead to lower voter turnout.
Now, that's surprising to me. You would think that if you make the system seem more fair, that would encourage more people to participate.
Right. But the book suggests that the opposite can actually happen. So by reducing the number of competitive races, because now it's harder for challengers to, mount a serious campaign, these limits on campaign donations and overall spending can actually make people feel like their vote doesn't really matter because the outcome is already pretty much a foregone conclusion, right? The incumbent is going to win anyway. And so they're less likely to actually bother going to the polls.
Yeah, it's like, why bother if the outcome is already decided?
Right. And the book actually cites some statistics that show that, limits on corporate donations, limits on political action committee donations, which are called PESIs, and limits on overall campaign spending. All of those have been linked to lower voter turnout rates.
Wow, so it's almost like a paradoxical effect, right? You try to make things more democratic, and you end up making people feel like they have less of a voice.
Right. And then they also address this common accusation that PESIs, those political action committees, engage in what they call double giving.
And double giving, just for folks who aren't familiar, is this idea that, PACs will donate to candidates from both major parties. So no matter who wins, they have someone who owes them a favor. It's kind of like hedging their bets.
Right. But Freedomnomics actually presents a different picture based on their research. And they actually did interviews with people who run a lot of these major PACs. And they found that most of them actually have rules against donating to candidates from both parties in the same race. And in the rare cases where it does happen, it's usually because one of their own members is actually running in that race.
So it's not as common as people might think.
Right.
They suggest that this perception of double giving often comes from misinterpreting data. Like sometimes people will count individual employee donations as coming from the corporation itself, even though those employees might have their own personal reasons for supporting a particular candidate. Yeah. And then also donating to candidates in both the Democratic and Republican primaries, that's not necessarily the same as trying to, buy influence in the general election from both sides. The payee might just be supporting candidates who are in line with their goals, regardless of party affiliation. And even in those cases, they usually end up focusing their support on just one candidate in the general election. So they're saying that the motivations are often more complex than just trying to, buy influence.
It's not just this black and white situation. Exactly. Now, another really interesting point that the book makes is about something that's not often considered when we think about the cost of crime, and that's the loss of reputation. They argue that this is actually a really significant punishment, but it's often unquantified. And it especially hits people who are wealthy or who are in positions of high status much harder.
Yeah, because when we think about punishment for crime, we usually think about prison time, fines, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But reputation is a whole other dimension, right?
Exactly. And for a lot of people, especially people who have built careers, who have this high earning potential, the damage to their reputation can be the most severe and long-lasting consequence. I mean, think about it. If you're a doctor or a lawyer and you're convicted of a crime, it doesn't really matter how much money you have, right? Your career is pretty much over.
Right. And it's not just about, not being able to practice your profession anymore. It's also about the social stigma, the shame, the loss of trust that comes with that.
Exactly. And the book actually uses a really interesting hypothetical example to illustrate this point. They imagine a bank teller who's earning a pretty modest salary and a bank manager who's earning a much higher salary, and they're both convicted of the same crime. Let's say they both embezzled a significant amount of money.
So they're both guilty of the same crime.
Right. And they'll both obviously face the legal penalties for that crime. But the manager's future earning potential is likely to be much more drastically reduced by the damage to their reputation. They're probably not going to be able to get another high-paying management job, right? Whereas the teller, their career path might not be as severely impacted. It's kind of like the higher up you are, the further you have to fall, and the more your professional life relies on that trust and that good reputation.
Yeah, it's like you're more vulnerable in a way because you have more to lose.
Exactly. And then what's even more interesting is that the book argues that wealthy individuals who have been convicted of crimes, they can even have trouble finding lower paying jobs afterwards because potential employers might see them as overqualified and likely to leave as soon as a better opportunity comes along. So it's like their very success and experience now works against them.
Wow, that's really ironic. It's like you're punished for being successful in a way.
Right. And the book points out that these reputational consequences, they're rarely even discussed in these debates about, fairness in the justice system, even though they often result in wealthier individuals facing more significant negative impacts on their lives and their careers in the long run.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's like there are all these invisible costs that we don't always account for. And speaking of invisible costs, the book also talks about this idea of market-based solutions versus government mandates. And they give a couple of really interesting examples of how letting the market work might actually lead to better outcomes in certain situations than trying to impose these top-down solutions from the government.
Yeah, absolutely. One area where they talk about this is the issue of eminent domain. So this is the government's power to take private property for public use, even if the owner of that property doesn't want to sell.
Right. And this is always controversial, right? Because it's this clash between what's good for the public and the rights of individual property owners. And then, of course, there's always this big debate about what constitutes fair market value for that property.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Freedomnomics actually highlights a really interesting market-based alternative to that kind of traditional eminent domain approach. They talk about how companies like Koch Industries, when they're building pipelines, for example, they'll actually offer contracts that are above market value to property owners along various potential routes for that pipeline. And then the project basically proceeds along the route where they get the first complete set of agreements.
So it's like they're letting the property owners decide for themselves if the offer is good enough, rather than just forcing them to sell.
Exactly. And it creates this kind of incentive for property owners to, if they're okay with selling, to do it quickly, because if they wait too long, they might miss out on that premium price.
Right, because once they have enough agreements to proceed along a particular route, they don't need to buy any more properties.
Exactly. And it's this really interesting way of, using market forces to achieve a public good without resorting to that kind of heavy-handed government approach. And another area where the book kind of critiques government involvement is in these really strict professional licensing requirements that we see in a lot of industries. So the intention behind these requirements is often to try to ensure quality and protect consumers, right? But the book questions whether passing these really rigorous exams shouldn't be enough to demonstrate that someone is competent to do a particular job. They suggest that these requirements, which are often set by the professional associations themselves, sometimes end up being more about limiting competition than they are about actually ensuring quality.
Yeah, it's kind of like protecting the turf, right? Making it harder for new people to enter the profession.
Exactly. And they use examples from fields like law and optometry, where there are often these really lengthy and costly educational requirements before someone can even take the licensing exams.
Yeah, it's like, why do you need to go to law school for 3 years
Yeah.
and rack up all that debt if you can prove that you know the law by passing the bar exam?